And we like things about which we can say Judaism is different because we have a better answer because. And in creation, we and the Christians were essentially in the same boat. So we avoided the question. But if there were any questions, I mean, theology was not the great subject of Jews in the 20th century. Yes, we were too busy surviving. We were too busy surviving the transition from Russia and Poland to America, too busy surviving a third of us being slaughtered, too busy creating a state of Israel, saving Soviet Jewry. That's what we did in the 20th century. We were surviving and putting our lives back together after the greatest upheaval in Jewish history, no question about it. If there were theological questions on Jews' minds in the 20th century, they were two: providence and authority. Providence, how could God let it happen? Where was God? And authority, of course, did God really say we have to do it? If God didn't really say we have to do it in the literal sense, then why do we have to do it? What's left of Torah or mitzvot after biblical criticism? Those questions were on lots of Jews' minds, I think. Certainly the former on everybody's mind, the latter at least on rabbis' minds. But creation was something we could put aside. However, if you look at the classical Jewish theologies, creation is right at the heart of them. You go to the two great theological edifices of the Middle Ages, the Rambam and the Zohar. Those are the two grand theologies, I would say, theological strategies of the Middle Ages. The rational and the Kabbalistic, the philosophic and the Kabbalistic. Both of them are filled with creation. The Rambam spends a great deal of time trying to prove creation in time, fighting with Aristotle about it, bringing in principles of Aristotelian physics and so on to try to prove it. He doesn't quite succeed, he says, he admits in the end, but he's close. The Aristotelian position has not been proven, etc. Because he knows miracles depend on creation. Providence depends on creation. Ultimately, Geulah depends on creation. The whole edifice is there because God created the world. God can do so and so, God does do so and so. If you open any page of the Zohar, it goes back again to the story of the emergence of the Sphirot, or the beginning, the emergence of the creative process within God that then overflows into the lower worlds. It's all about creation. And the Zohar too understands that that's the very center of Jewish theology. In modern times, I would say with creation set aside, it was more the quest for meaning, the personal quest. We made the existential move. And then it's the quest for meaning that stands at the center, not creation. But in the 21st century is different than the 20th. I believe, you see, that's what radical Judaism is about, in a nutshell. The two great battles that religion fought in the 20th century are over. And we lost them both in a certain sense. The battle against Darwin and against evolution and the old earth, and the battle against biblical criticism and scientific scholarship and what that means in terms of its implications. The forces of traditional religion lost both of those battles. But we're still here. We still have religious needs. We're still religious people. We still have some kind of longing for Ahavat Hashem and Yirat Hashem. So how do we put a Judaism together after those 20th century questions are more or less settled, while being intellectually honest and at the same time trying to be spiritually alive? That's the challenge to my mind, and that's what the book is about. In the 21st century, I think creation is the theological question. The theological question. Why? It's obvious, because I believe the most important role religion is going to have by the middle of this century will be helping motivate people to change their behavior in radical ways so that this planet can survive as fit for habitation by higher species. I think we're in very big trouble. We're in trouble vastly increased by the irresponsibility of political leadership in these opening years, this opening decade of the 20th century. I'm very sorry to say, including the failure this year in Washington to do anything. And it's not going to get better. It's not going to go away. If you need to say this was a year that shows it, this indeed was a year that shows that climate change is real. Last year they could pretend and say, well, look, it wasn't so hot this year, maybe it's okay. This year nobody's saying that. I believe that religion will be very important. a very important factor. Maybe even you could say, be so daring as to say the salvation of humanity may not come out of the heavens, but it may depend upon religion. Because getting vast human populations to change the way they think about their relationship to the world in which they live, the relationship between the human and the natural orders, the way we use resources, the way we overconsume and take terrible risks. Think about how much more drilling are we going to do in the Gulf before, and after all, there are economic factors and jobs and things like that, and what do? So we continue taking risks. We go ahead, but all of that costs. All of that will cost tremendously. And that means that somewhere in mid-century or late 21st century, I believe we will face a terrible crisis. I think we will need some kind of much stronger United Nations and world government to impose on human populations what has to happen, the way we have to change our lives and ration our consumption. And religion will play a very important role in getting people to understand that a shift in our underlying myths is somehow needed. And we'll need to call upon the forces that live within all the religious traditions in order to do that. And in that conversation, I think we will have a lot to offer. I think we can play a very important role in that conversation, and that's why I'm so especially concerned about it. What do, in the broadest sense, let's ask this, what do we religious people, and I now use the term in an all-embracing way, what does the religious mind, what do we as religious people have to contribute to this discussion of evolution? In what way are we still believers after we understand the geological origins of the planet, the process of natural selection, and so on? Does God have any relationship to that? Is there a place for God in all that, once we accept that that's the case? If there's no place for God in all that, then God is really an idea. Then God really is something that originates in the human mind, and there we have Hermann Cohen on one side and Mordecai Kaplan on the other, the great naturalist theologians in some ways of the 20th century Jewry. Both of them post-Kantian, saying, of course we can't escape the human mind. God is an idea of the human mind. And God and the idea of God, the reality of God and the idea of God, are very much assimilated to one another. They become more or less the same thing. So I go back to my opening paragraph in this book, and I hope you at least got that far in chapter 1. Evolution is a tale, perhaps even the tale, where the sacred waits to be discovered. There is a one that reveals itself to us within and behind the great diversity of life. That one is being itself, the constant and the ever-changing and the endlessly changing evolutionary parade. I understand that one, and I capitalize one, and I capitalize being throughout that part of the book so you understand what I'm talking about. I understand God as that one, as the one that lies behind and within evolution, the one that takes on all the forms of evolution. If you want it in Kabbalistic language, it's really a kind of emanation theology. It's a hitlabshut. God puts on the coat of many colors. God puts on the garments of every species that ever is to exist, of every creature that ever is to exist. God is there inside them all, but God is the one, the continuity behind all the great varieties of species. Now, some of you will be comfortable with a more theistic language, more conventional theistic language than I am. It doesn't make any difference. You may say the Shekhinah is that hitlabshut, is that underlying presence of God, but that God is also beyond that, is also transcendent to that. To my mind, as you read in this introduction, to my mind, transcendence is real, but transcendence exists within immanence. Transcendence to me doesn't mean God lives out there somewhere far away on the other side of the sky, but transcendence rather means that God is present here in this moment in such a profound way that we will never be able to fathom it. And therefore, immanence remains transcendent, or divine presence remains transcendent. It escapes us. The whole is more than the sum of its parts, and therefore panentheism rather than pantheism, etc. But you read that. For me, the fact that Shem Havaya, the Shem Yud He Vav He, which is the name God reveals to Moses, of course, is really being, b'chiluf otiyot. Havaya is existence in Hebrew. Yud He Vav He is existence itself with the letters switched around. Yud He Vav He, I insist in teaching, is not a noun at all. It's an impossible conflation of the verb to be. It's Hayah, Hoveh, Yihiyeh, all smushed together in a form that doesn't exist. As though to say you can somehow capture it. You can capture the transcendence of time in that moment by putting past, present, and future all together. Of course, if you think it's a noun, if God says, if you think you've got me in a little box, you understand me because you've got that noun, I will run away and conjugate myself and become a verb again, which is what Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh means, exactly. Zeshmi Hashem, but then Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh. No, I'm going to remain a verb. It's not only reform that's a verb, right? It's also God. It's also Yud He Vav He. Yud He Vav He remains a verb, remains elusive. And the elusiveness is important, but the elusiveness doesn't mean that it isn't immanent, that it isn't present in all things. So when I talk about God, I talk about the one within and behind the many. The one that exists within and behind the many, that takes on the forms of the many. Itlabshut, itpashtut. What I am suggesting is that what we religious people have to bring to the conversation is the notion of what Heschel called radical amazement. To be able to look at the world, the same world everybody else sees, and see something magnificent about it. See that it all is filled with mystery, filled with divine presence. And you begin to ask questions, of course, about the evolutionary process itself. You begin to ask, what would it mean to see the evolutionary process through the eyes of wonder, through the eyes of radical amazement? And I brought you some examples in the book, the relationship between climate and flora and fauna and how that happens. How it was that one-celled animals evolved into multi-celled animals, and eventually some of them came up onto dry land out of the sea, that Nachshon-like moment when they step forth onto land. And how all of them coming from the same ancestors, how some of them become what we call plants and put roots in the soil and derive nourishment that way, and others instead develop legs and walk around and derive nourishment that way. We all come from the same one-celled animals. The amazement of that, the astounding quality of that, the relationship between bees and blossoms, and how that evolved over thousands of years, and how they need one another and are there for one another. All of that, to me, is just filled with a kind of poetic magnificence that we need to bring to the table in our conversation with scientists and in the awareness of ordinary human beings. Science and religion are not engaged in a great battle, and we didn't lose that battle. We were asking the wrong question. We were trying to disclaim, trying to argue, trying to fight a rearguard action against science. That's silly. What do you call them? Intelligent design people are mostly silly. Oh, look, you haven't proven this particular link, so maybe it's just a theory and not fact, and therefore we don't have to teach it. That's not Eshkeit in terms of how you do it. We have something much bigger to bring to the table, and that is the poetic mind. That is the grand vision that all of this is a sacred process in which God can be found. The language of Nes B'toch HaTeva, Nes B'toch HaTeva, that the natural and supernatural are deeply tied together and are inseparable. And this was one of my arguments with Kaplan in the days when I was more involved in arguing with Kaplan. That the natural and the supernatural are tied together is an old Jewish idea. The footnotes are the Ramban, the Maharal of Prague, and the Yitzhak of Berdichev, if you want the intellectual history lineage. But the Ramban is the first one who talks about that, who talks about what appears to be natural is really supernatural. Now, there are two different ways of seeing Nes B'toch HaTeva. You could say, Megillat Esther is Nes B'toch HaTeva. That is to say, it seems to be happening in a purely natural way, but really the divine hand is guiding it. So people say, look, 1948 must have been a miracle. Nobody asked what about 1944 in that conversation, of course, but 1948 must have been a miracle. But there's another way of saying it. It's not that we don't understand It's not that we don't understand that there really is hashgacha pratit, particular providence underlying it, doing it the way it's supposed to come out, but rather that the natural itself is wondrous and is a and reveals the presence of God. Seeing nature as supernatural. So I say somewhere, I think I have marked the line here where I say, here on this smallish planet in the middle of an otherwise undistinguished galaxy, something so astonishing has taken place that it indeed demands to be called by the biblical term miracle rather than by the Greco-Latin nature. Even though the two are pointing to the exact same set of facts. The descendants of one-celled creatures grew and developed, emerged onto dry land, learned survival skills, developed language and thought, until a subset of them could have this conversation, could reflect on the nature of the entire process and seek to derive meaning from it. That's what we are noticing about reality, and noticing that itself should be a wondrous and transformative thing. And that's what I think I want to ask you to bring to people this Rosh Hashanah. Creation itself is a kind of revelation, if we know how to read the book. St. Bernard of Clairvaux says to his disciples one day, his famous commentary in the Song of Songs, his disciples one day, today we will not read in the book of Scripture, we'll read in the book of nature. That the book of nature itself becomes a kind of scripture for us. My dear friend Bernie McGinn at the University of Chicago, great historian of Christian mysticism, is the one who gave me that line. And there is much, of course, in the Franciscan tradition and so on that goes with it. But the Baal Shem Tov goes with it too, remember. The Baal Shem Tov, who was a revolutionary figure in many ways at the heart of traditional Judaism. It all begins with a story, of course, apocryphal story about the Baal Shem Tov as a child, that he would always be missing from school when they go out and find him in the woods, because that was where he found God. And that God can be found in the woods and in nature, and not only in the book, was something that Judaism needed to relearn at that period, because we had become overly bookish and overly urbanized. We are in the course of learning that, I must say. I'm very proud of these new groups, Teva and Adama, and all these projects that are taking Jews back into the soil and into the ground, into the natural world, and trying to reroot Judaism in it. All that is part of this effort, and goes with that kind of understanding that I'm talking about for a creation, for a theology of creation. Now we have a particular interest, we Jews, as Jews, have a particular interest in the emergence of this new creation story. By the way, it's happening. There's a wonderful little attempt by the late Thomas Berry and I think it's Bill McKibben to write the universe story, a kind of creation story. Imagine taking Darwin and rewriting it in biblical prose and seeing what it sounds like. They tried. Berry was, Alav Shalom, was a Catholic priest, died last year, a great thinker in this area. But he was trying too hard not to be a Christian. So there's no Judeo-Christian language in it. It's all strictly scientific. But I believe we need to recreate that language in a more Jewish way. We have a particular interest in the story because we gave the Western world the class creation story. That story of Maaseh Bereshit, as we have it at the beginning of Genesis, is of course what sustained and nourished Western humanity for the last more than 2,000 years. And that story had certain values. Yes, the value of rest, the value of God loving everything God created. Tov, 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 tov. That's all God says in the first chapter of Bereshit. By the way, the first time God says lo tov is, of course, lo tov heyot adam levado. But in Bereshit Aleph, it's all tov, tov, tov. And that means that everything is created out of God's love. Everything is created because God wanted it to be that way. And it has something to do with the place of human beings and our responsibility. Urdu doesn't mean rule at your whim over, but rather means take responsibility for. So I disagree with Lynn White and that whole school that says the biblical attitude of human dominance is responsible for our destruction of the universe. I rather think the biblical voice hasn't been listened to, because the biblical voice is one of responsibility. Now, in the Tanakh itself, I think you can say we have two models. We have the model of Bereshit Aleph, where Adam and Chava are created at the end. God, you remember, according to the Midrash, creates the wedding feast and then invites the Chassan and Kala in. But we also have another model that I feel more comfortable with, where we are simply part of the symphony of creation. Look at Psalm 148, Hallelu et Hashem min hashamayim. Look at today's Rosh Chodesh, look at Baruch Nafshi, Psalm 104. Those are great sort of hymns to creation in which the human being is part of the symphony of creation, and we belong within it rather than above or outside it. By the way, John Milton said it was worth learning the Hebrew language just to be able to read the 104th Psalm in the original. So on Rosh Chodesh we should certainly mention that. It would be a wonderful text from which to think about building a new vision of Jewish creation theology. Ya'alu shamayim yerdu tehomot, harim hagvohim la'elim, and so on, Livyatan zeyatzar telesachek bo, and then a Yetzei Adam lefa'olo, man goes out to his work right in the middle of that. It's just a magnificent view of creation. If you're thinking about talking about creation, bring that psalm in, certainly. So that is what I think we should do. Talking about wonder, trying to evoke that sense of the wonder, the yirah in that sense, yamim noraim, yirah, awe and wonder, the wonder of what these days mean, and using to as understood as days of wonder, days of amazement, and trying to take us back to how we might see the world in which we live through a different set of glasses, and what Judaism might have to contribute to that different set of glasses. Of course, when we talk about retelling the tale of creation, remember that we did it once before, and that's why I talk a little bit in the passage you read about the ancient Near Eastern creation story and what the Tanakh did to it. Yes, the ancient Near Eastern creation story, the story of the sky gods versus the sea gods. Yes, Marduk and Baal are the younger gods, and they become more powerful than Yam and Tiamat. And Yam and Tiamat don't like that and rebel against the authority of the sky gods and are slain, and the earth is created on their corpses. That's the grand ancient Near Eastern creation story that everybody knew. Everybody knew that story. From Bavel to Ugarit and Canaan, they knew that story. And it's reflected all over the Tanakh. It's reflected in Mikolot Mayim Rabim Adirim Ishbereyam. Yes, the dead gods underneath are rising up. It's reflected still in the Midrash, where when Israel crossed the Red Sea, the Sar Shel Yam sticks his head up, and God has to slay it again, and so on. It lives. That ancient myth lives as long as the Zohar even. But there are footnotes to that, but I won't give them now. That was a tale of violence. It was a tale of aggression and competition among the gods. We took that story and buried it under a new harmonistic version. Tov, 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 tov. God loves everything. I'm suggesting that we have a new creation story in our time, and that's the Darwinian story. And it too has lots of violence, the survival of the fittest, the great mound of evolutionary corpses, all those species that died out because they weren't smart enough or weren't pretty enough to attract the right mates or to defeat their predators and consume their prey, and so they died out. How do we retell that story without denying it, without fighting it? How do we retell that story as a tale of grandeur and oneness and the emergence of what has come out of this great creative history? So that's what I think we should do this Rosh Hashanah. Now I wanted to give you a little bit of a text to play with in the course of that. The very first text you have, Tiferet Uziel. I was at this point going to take a break and say, do this v'chavruta, and we'll come back, but the printing came out so bad, I'm afraid I've got to read you the text. Yeshida Tiferet Uziel on the top page. Rabbi Uziel Meislich, one of the disciples of the Maggid of Mezrich. I happened to stumble upon this text because my current project, some of you will want to know, my current project is to do for the circle of the Maggid what I did for the Sfas Emes. I have three wonderful students of mine, three wonderful younger faculty in our rabbinical school who are going through the text with me, the Kiddushat Levi and Morei Naim and Noam Elimelech, that whole circle of the Maggid's disciples, and we're picking out the 3 or 4 top hits for each parsha, translating them, writing a little contemporary commentary on them, just as I did in the language of truth. So, Rabbi Uziel Meislich, who not many people have read in the last 200 years, I would dare say, came up with this one. He's in that list of Talmidei HaMaggid who did not have dynasties that came after them. And if you want to follow it in English, it's on the back page, but try to follow with in the poorly printed Hebrew if you can. This is a pasuk. It begins with the pasuk in Vayikra, Parshat Bechukotai, but this pasuk is in the Zichronot for Rosh Hashanah liturgy, and that's especially why I brought it to. This is one of the 10 psukim in Zichronot. V'zacharti et priti Yaakov, v'avet priti Yitzchak, v'avet priti Avraham, v'ha'aretz ezkor. That's the whole pasuk. Again, v'zacharti et priti Yaakov, avet priti Yitzchak, v'avet priti Avraham ezkor, v'ha'aretz ezkor. K'sheyazvu avonam. This is now, that remember happens after the Tochacha. Parshat Bechukotai is the shorter Tochacha. And so after the Tochacha, when God says he'll come back, he says, I'll remember the ancestors and I'll remember the land. Of course, this is in the context, this is after the Shemitah, Hilchot Shemitah in Bahar, and then the Tochacha for not observing that and other laws. K'sheyazvu avonam, v'yikana libam he'arel, ezkor zchut avot, limchol avonam lahem. אך ידוע שהעבירות שבין אדם לחברו וכולי, the whole quote is of course from the Mishnah, עבירות שבין אדם לחברו אינם מתכפרים עד שירצה את חברו. Yes, avonot between God and man are atoned for on Yom Kippur, but avonot ben adam lachavero, of course, are not atoned for ad shiratze et chavero, until you appease your chaver, until you appease the one who was harmed by you. Ad shiratze et chavero. Uva'avon sheben adam lachavero, yesh shnei avonot. Echad, kinegdo yitbarach. One avon is against God, negdo yitbarach. Shehu yitbarach tziva shelo la'ashok chavero v'chadome. Because God commanded us not to oppress our fellow person. Lo la'ashok chavero, and other things like that, v'chadome. Ve'echad ma shechote l'chavero. And the other is the actual sin you commit against the chaver. V'ha'avon she'avar al retzon kono. Now the first part of that transgression, the one you did against God, against your Maker, al retzon kono. K'shehera lechavero, when you were bad to your fellow person, you sinned against God. Kvar nitkaper, al yidei kniyat halev v'havidui. Well, Yom Kippur or the Yom Kippurs take care of that. Yes, kniyat halev, we make our hearts humble, we submit our hearts, and we confess vidui. So God forgives us. God hears those things and God forgives. Aval mashachata neged chavero lo nitkaper bazeh ad sheyiratzeh lechavero. But that which you sinned against your fellow person is not atoned for until you go up to that person and say, I'm sorry, until you appease that person. V'zeh v'ha'aretz ezkor. Ki ma shechatu negdi b'ma shelo shamru hashmita emchol lahem k'sheyachniu levavam. That which they sinned against me by not keeping the Shemitah, I will forgive them when they make their hearts contrite. There's Kor Zchut Avot. Now remember Zchut Avot. And that's why it says, "V'zacharti et briti Yaakov et briti Yitzchak v'et briti Avraham." I'll remember Zchut Avot, and I'll forgive them for their sin against me. Aval adayin ve'haaretz eskor. But the land is still there, because you have sinned against the land. So the sin against the land becomes the sin ben adam l'chavero. The land is the chaver whom you have hurt. So even though I have already forgiven them for the sin against me, v'haaretz eskor, but I will remember the land. Mashechatu la'aretz shelo shamru hashmita. The sin against the land for not keeping the shmita, and I don't have to tell you how you can expand the sense of shmita in that way. Uvazet tzarich piyus la'aretz. For that we have to, how do you translate piyus? Assuage. We have to assuage the land. We have to convince the land that we are contrite, of our contrition. Uvazet tzarich piyus la'aretz. Ki medubar lemala. V'lachen katav v'haaretz tiretz et shabtoteha. The land will tiretz et shabtoteha. It will fulfill the desire of its Shabbatot, the Shabbatot you missed. V'tiretz, you understand, is taken from Adshe yiratze et chavero. The land still has demands of ritzui. V'haaretz tiretz et shabtoteha means the land will still demand the ritzui, the compensation for its Shabbatot that you caused it to miss. V'az hem yiratzu et avonam legamrei. And only then will they satisfy the demand of their sin. So how do we ask forgiveness of the earth? That's what we're being called upon to do here. To ask forgiveness of the earth. By what words? No words. By what actions? How will we achieve piyus with the land? How will we convince the earth that we humans are not its enemies and not out to destroy it? Well, you could say that's personifying the earth. The earth is just soil, but that's what he's doing. Chavero here, the earth becomes chavero. And that's why I'm so very struck by this passage. I think it's one of the most, for our age, one of the most relevant things I can find in Hasidic literature. Thinking about the earth as a partner in existence. That's what a chaver is really, yes? Achirat Seit Chavero means you're equal, you're partner. So we in the earth are partners in this drama of existence. And that earth demands ritzui, it demands v'tiretz echabtotea. It has to get what it demands, which means it has to forgive us. And we are not forgiven until it forgives us. So then what is the new partnership between human society and the land that we have to offer the land so we can begin this process of ritzui? That is the kind of foundational text for this conversation or this Torah. Maybe it will somehow be helpful. I'm going to wind up in just a minute because I'd like some time for questions and conversation still in this, and I don't have a watch in front of me, but I hope we've still got a few minutes. And stop wearing a watch. These days the cell phone becomes my watch, and then when I put the cell phone away, I give the eye of transcendent to time. What we're saying in any reading of this is that to be a religious person is to notice, is to see with this inner eye, or to see with this eye of radical amazement, what the world is and what the evolutionary process is, and how we can still call that evolutionary process creation, because we see the constant flow of new creative processes out of it and see it with the eyes of wonder and name it. Whether we name it God, or name it the handiwork of God, or name it the presence of God, or name it Shekhinah, I'm not concerned with the theological details, but we name it as sacred. But to be a religious person is not only to notice, it's to do something else, it's the next step. To notice and to respond. to notice and to respond. To be able to say, Anna Avda Dekuchabrichu. I am here ready to serve. I am here ready to serve this wonder or this miracle or this sacred world that I have discovered. Ayeka, the call to us, needs an answer, and the answer to Ayeka is Hineni. And if Judaism is about anything, it's about responsibility. And I think in the emergence of these new Jewish environmental and Baptist groups, we're beginning to see some of that sense of Jewish responsibility in this most urgent struggle that humanity has to offer, has before it. So I ask, in this age, when we live in a global village, and when all the religions need to be called upon to draw forth their responses to this crisis that's going to happen to us, what do we Jews have to offer? What do we Jews have to say we can bring to the table in this conversation? And those are some of the values of the old story. Let's be sure that the new creation story leaves lots of room for human dignity, for Tzelem Elokim, because that's our essential moral teaching. That's the basis of all Jewish moral teaching, that every person is a unique and vital Tzelem Elohim. That's what Ben Azai taught, and that made debate with Rabbi Akiva, and I am a chassid of Ben Azai's for many years. We need to understand that the whole process is holy, that the Anochi of Sinai is already there, the Aleph of Anochi is already there in the Bet of Breshit, if you want to say it in that language, which is to say that creation itself is a revelation of God, and that in that we can raise Judaism to a plane of a way of thinking about the universal questions that confront humanity, because as I said at the beginning, that's what the liturgy of Rosh Hashanah precisely calls upon us to do. Thank you. Questions, conversation, dialogue, this may be the most interesting part, so please feel free. Yes, straight ahead, thank you. Name, verbal, Laura, hi. I'm just looking.
Laura Geller, Temple Emmanuel. I am confused about the mysterious way in which being loves me.
Yes. You see, the question is always, Green, are you talking about a personal God? Is God personal to you? And I'm not, the answer is, I'm not talking in the primary sense about a super person. I am talking about a process, though in my tefillah I continue to personify, because I need to personify. I'm a human being, and for us to love, it's hard for us to love an abstraction, and therefore we personify. But even in the abstract sense, I have a sense, Laura, that this one that takes on the coat of many colors, that is present in each form, and in each flower, and in each bee, and in each human being, for a fleeting instant of the history of existence, does so because it takes delight in doing so. There is a kind of sha'ashua, a kind of divine enjoyment of being present in all of this. That our religion is one that calls for oneg v'simcha, seems to be in response to both to the magnificence and to the joy of this whole process. The word simcha, by the way, sameach, was a wonderful article, back in the 30s. Julian Morgenstern at HUC in Cincinnati wrote an article, how sameach often means to shine in biblical Hebrew. And so I think of a kind of a shining presence and a joy that goes through existence, and we are somehow there in response to it. So I believe that it enjoys being in this form that it got named Avraham Yitzchak ben Mordechai ve'Ethel for a few years, for a half an instant of time, and therefore my job is to return that joy, is to give the one as much pleasure as it can derive out of this form doing what it should have done during that time, just like the bee needs to get to many flowers as it needs to get to, and the other creature needs to do what it needs to do. I need to do what I need to do to give joy in response to the joy I have received. The whole process is about mashpia mekabel. We are receivers of the great flow of life that flows into us, and we have to learn to become givers as well as receivers. We have to learn to become mashpiim, which is to say to give that energy back. And the giving of that energy in both directions I take as an act of delight and joy. Please.
Yeah. Might continue the tradition of Emmanuel congregation in Chicago, Michael said. On one foot, pantheism and theology.
Yeah. Want to hold the other foot? No good answer. It's not that we have solved the problem of theodicy. It's the problem. Of course, the problem of theodicy comes out this way in my theology. Why did evolution have to happen in this violent and competitive way? Why do we have to have somewhere in the back of our minds two young bucks battling their horns against one another, competing for territory or for females or for something else, especially among men? Why is there such a legacy of violence? I'm going to talk a little bit more about that this afternoon. Why is there such a legacy of violence that we have? And I don't have an answer to the question. Couldn't it have happened in a smoother way? Couldn't it have happened in a more blessed way? But somehow, that's the way the evolutionary process works. Now, evolution works also in species like ants and bees and humans by cooperation. Because we ants and bees and humans can't do anything unless we work collectively, unless we build together. Do you want to say on some level there's a primal male and primal female gene in that? There is something to be said for that, but I wouldn't overstate it. The competitive, aggressive versus the cooperative society building. Women have a greater tendency toward cooperation and building community, while men seem to have that lone path that competes against the other guy. There is some of that, but all of us, of course, all of us have both of those male and female genes. It's a question of how we balance it. So how do we take that legacy? We have to admit that we have that legacy, that fierce legacy of aggression and competition in us. But how do we temper it with the other legacy of cooperation, building society, building humanity? Because we are aware of both of those parts of our genetic legacy, of our evolutionary legacy, we have to be in control of balancing them. I think that's the key. We have to be in control of saying which one will I use, how much, and how. Yes, I'm not an utter socialist. Capitalism, in a certain restricted way, seems to work better. And capitalism, after all, is a legacy of bucking against the other guy. And yet I have to put some controls on it because I am a human being, not just an elk in the wilderness. But that's enough of it for now. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Scott Burlow from Don Shalom. I wanted to know about the moral response to the experience of wonder. So, is the moral response to kind of, to be sort of the artists, or sort of the artists that are said, that are the assuagement that you're talking about, is it kind of a necessary imperative that flows from wonder, or is the source of morality, does it come from some kind of other obligation?
Yes. I think I would be foolish not to say that it comes from the long tradition we have of moral responsibility and halakha and civilization and all the things that have built morality into us as a Jewish society. But in my own personal response here, I don't really separate them. That is to say, it seems to me, this is Kierkegaard, if you will, the religious versus the aesthetic, that the response to the magnificence of the universe is not just to envision, not just to see it, not just to see how beautiful it is and celebrate it. Celebration is easy. But then responding to it in a sense of, I kneel before you, and what can I do to help? What can I do to be part of this process? What can I do to carry this process forward? What can I do to preserve this wonder? That to me seems to come as a natural part of that response, and that's, from a Jewish point of view, that's what makes it a religious response and not just an aesthetic response. But shaped by the whole legacy and tradition we come from, of course. Please.
Larry Seidenberg, Northern California. For most people, Lobster's theology is dominated by the Transcendent, Rosh Hashanah, Tevum, Viva H, Viva Mayim. How do you map that liturgy into what you're talking about?
So that's why I talked about the other part. I talked about V'chein Ten Pachtecha, because that's what I think is really great about the Rosh Hashanah liturgy. I am not a big fan of Jonathan Togef. When Larry Hoffman asked me to contribute to his book on Jonathan Togef, I said, "Oy vey, I don't think I can do that." Now let me tell you briefly about a wonderful conversation that Larry Kushner and I had 20 years ago at a conference run by the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. We were talking about, Larry got up and said something very nice. He said, rabbis are ungrateful. I don't know if he said ungrateful SOBs, but he might have. Rabbis are ungrateful. Jewish life is about two cycles, the year cycle and the life cycle. The year cycle, the cycle of holidays through the year, the calendar, and the life cycle, of course, proceeding from birth to bar mitzvah, so bar mitzvah to death, and so on. He said the year cycle among Jews is in terrible trouble. Nobody comes to shul because it's Shmini Atzeres. Nobody even knows it's the second day of Pesach, yes? So the rabbi walks into the synagogue, looks out at the people out there, sees 400 Jews, and says, "Oy, they're here for Shelton's bar mitzvah. They're not here because it's Parshas Pinchas. They're not here because it's Shabbos Nachamu. They're not here because it's Parshat HaChodesh. They don't even know what that is. They're here because of Sheldon's bar mitzvah again. And I'm tired of seeing bar mitzvah guests." He says, accept that Judaism is shifting more into the life cycle, and we need to use the life cycle in some ways to buttress the year cycle as well, not to ignore the year cycle, to buttress the year cycle as well. So I said to Larry, that's a really interesting analysis, but what about Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? Why is shul filled on Kol Nidre night? And then we both said, of course, that's not, Yamim Noreim are not about year cycle, they're about life cycle. They're a life cycle statement. Here I am, God, thank you, I'm alive another year, I really appreciate it. Goodbye. That's what it is. That's what most of the folks in your synagogue are there for. I'm alive another year, I didn't deserve it, I don't know why, but I notice. I notice that somehow, or I feel guilty/grateful about that. So I'm here for a minute from Sanatokef. Mi yechyehu mi amut, I see it. I hope it's not me next time, goodbye. And that's to realize that that's what's going on. Now, I'll up-level it for you for a moment, pulling out something we're going to say this afternoon, but I'll say it now. So the Sfas Emes says, Zochrenu l'chayim, Kotvenu l'chayim, Kotvenu l'chayim, he says, every person, every Jew, he says, I say every person, has the word chayim written in his or her heart. But over the course of the year, that chayim becomes covered with grime because of the fast pace at which we live, because of the violence of our society, because of our sins. So Rosh Hashanah comes along, and we have to wipe it off. We have to wipe it clean so we can see the chayim written in our hearts. And that's connected to Katvei Maluach Libecha. Yes, the chayim is written in our hearts. And we have to, Kodvenu l'chaim doesn't mean write us in the book. Can I tell you, the motif of the book of life and death is something we picked up from the Babylonians. It's an interesting thing, it belonged to the Babylonian New Year. I don't think literally it's the most, it's the best thing we got. That sense of your fate is sealed for a year when we know Tfilah b'chol yom, when we know Sharei Tima la'olam, Einam nin'alin, and so on, all those things that say Adam nishpat b'chol yom, Adam nidon b'chol yom, the idea that somehow the fate is sealed for a year written in the book, that's not the part of Rosh Hashanah I would choose to emphasize and teach. While they're there for that one, and they are there for that one, his life cycle, try and get some of the other part of Rosh Hashanah in. That's what I would say is we have a good shot to do that, and I would say that should be our best effort. If they come away thinking it's all about life and death and being written in the book, I think we didn't do our job. Yes, please. Yeah.
Doug Cohen in Redlands.
I'm sorry, say it again?
I'm Doug Cohen in Redlands.
Hi.
You mentioned asking forgiveness of the earth. This goes both ways. How about when the earth expresses us with floods and with fires and with illness and such? How does that dialogue go both directions?
Great. You know about Levi Yitzchak and how they celebrated Kol Nidre? He's told that you have to go to Chaim Shmerel, the innkeeper in such and such a town, and see what he does for Erev Yom Kippur. So he goes just before Kol Nidre, and he sees this Chaim Shmerel. Of course, he keeps asking for a Rabbi Chaim Shmerel, and finally finds a very ignorant person. He's sitting there with his sons around the table. They have a bottle of schnapps, and they have a big book open. And they have a list of all their sins in the book. And I did this, and I cheated a customer here, and I didn't keep Shabbos there, and I cut corners on something else. And they finish reading all the list of their sins, and then they start with so-and-so, a child died in our town, and so-and-so there was a flood, and so-and-so there was famine, and so many poor people went hungry. And in the end, they said, Rabbi Shalom, it doesn't look very good for you, but we'll make you a deal. If you forgive ours, we'll forgive yours. And they make a l'chaim. And that's part of the way to prepare for Kol Nidre. I don't have an answer to the indifference of nature, but being adults in our religious faith, and I talk a lot about a theme I call Judaism for adults. Being adults in our religious faith means we have learned to live with it. We've learned to accept it. You are all rabbis. You've all officiated the funerals of children, and terrible, terrible things that there is no justification for and no rhyme or reason for. But nature is indifferent to our individual needs. I mean, we suffer. What I can best say in such moments is we suffer so much in those moments because of the very best thing about us, which is our ability to love and become attached to one another. And that's why it hurts us so much. And I'm sure all of you have said something like that at some point in the funeral of a child. It's because of that love that makes us human, but that love also that makes us hurt, and that's who we are. But tziduk hadin for the indifference of nature is beyond me. Please.
Hi, Sharon Browse.
Hi Sharon, how are you?
Hi.
Nice to see you.
Good. So if you could have your way, and we all gave some version of this sermon this year, I wonder what kind of radical action you would ask us to ask our congregants to engage in. I mean, if they could actually...
Of course that's your question.
What's the big dream?
Well, the last one? This is the last one. Okay. Well, you have to ask how political you want to let yourself become in that situation. That obviously depends on your congregation and your setting. You can probably get away with more than some of the people in this room can get away with. But this is California, and California has been leading the country on environmental concern for a long time. I don't know where your senators have been and your Congress people have been with regard to this terrible debacle. I mean, I'm heartbroken. I'm an enthusiastic Barack Obama supporter, but the biggest reason I supported him was because I thought it was going to do something about the environment. And I'm stunned that this Democratic-controlled Congress did absolutely nothing, that in the end, even the weakest of bills, they said they couldn't get through. I'm stunned and deeply disappointed by that party that I supported. I'm not a contributor to political campaigns, but I even gave a little bit to that campaign because I was so in love, and I find myself very taken, very disappointed by that. And I think that's a question then of asking. So the political realm is one realm where that has to be done, because that's how we change things in a society. But in terms of local action, I don't know what your scene is, but I would say certainly working together with Christian groups or with non-Jewish groups, thinking about what kind of demonstration project is going to have a really big impact in this community. It's going to have a really big impact in Los Angeles, whatever it is. I don't know you have obviously big issues here in both air and water. Those are famous in this city. And so I would say working together with sympathetic groups from other religious traditions, pick something that will have a real impact, but also a big demonstrative impact, and get people working on it. I'm sorry that.